In this video, I will give you an overview of all the different settings that you can have with FIBERMESH. So when I go to my subtool palette, you see that I have a piece of mesh over here. I have a duplicate for comparison later on. And when I turn on polyframe, you can see that the surface has been a bit distorted to have larger and smaller polygons. So for starting, I'm going to create FIBERMESH without a mask. You can start FIBERMESH without a mask, and then all of the geometry will be infected with fibers, if you will. And if you create a mask, then the mask will modulate the distribution of the fibers. So first, without the mask, when I press preview, and you get a pop-up for a faster interaction speed while sculpting, it is recommended that the fiber mesh will be generated as single fibers. I usually press skip this node until next restart, because otherwise you will get this node every time you change some settings. And this is my result. Your result, if you do that, may be different, and that is because I have already changed some settings previously. Meaning that most of the settings I have set to 0. So by mask by 0, by area to 0. I have reset the profiles. I have set some max fibers to 0.1 and coverage to 1000. I will go over these one by one. But as I said, I have initialized most of them to 0 to see the effect of the changing of the parameters. So the first setting that I'm going to cover is the max fibers. This is the number of different fibers you will have. At the moment it is 0.1. If I increase this, you will see that it becomes very dense. So I'm going to set this back to 0.1, 0.3, populate the geometry with more fibers. So this is the number of fibers. A thing to note is that I already have set profile to 4. This means that I have 4 sides. So when I set this to 1, you get flat planes. I have set that to 4 to have rectangular fibers. Another thing to note is that in preview settings, I have my fast preview off. If you are working with a lot of fibers, it may be to your advantage to turn fast preview on for faster interaction with ZBrush. But when testing out what kind of fibers you want to create, and I suggest you do that before you actually start doing actual production, you can turn fast preview on and off, and you can do that also after you have created fibers. So when I were to accept this as my fibers and go to that subtool and then go to preview settings, I still can turn it into a fast preview even when they are already converted to geometry. So that is a very important thing to note. So as I said, the max fibers decides how many fibers you will generate. After that, you have the density variations. So you can put some variation into it as far as density is concerned. It's just a variation slider. And then you come to by mask. I have set this to 0 and by area to 0. Now, if I change by mask, I will get not a difference because I have not created a mask. So this will not affect my fibers at the moment. By area will affect. So if I modulate by area, you see some of them become really tall because I have set it to a really high setting. So by area, if I set this to 1, that is more reasonable. Then you see, and I'm going to unhide my background geometry. So this is a copy of that plane to have an idea. So I have big polygons over here, and then my fibers are wider and longer than on smaller polygons. So by area to 0, then they are all as long. And when I set that to a higher setting, the smaller polygons have smaller fibers. In order to demonstrate the by mask slider, I'm first going to create a mask. So I'm going to mask lasso, okay. Make a selection, maybe grow it and sharpen it a bit like that, and then press the preview button. And I still had by area, so I'm going to set that to 0. And now fibers are only generated on the masked vertices or polygons, not on the ones that have no mask. Even with by mask set to 0. So what does by mask do? Well, by mask, if you higher it, it's going to concentrate the fibers more on the masked polygons, and polygons that have a lesser degree of masking, those fibers will get smaller, as you can see. So even with the mask, I can set by mask to 0, and then I get polygons only when there is some masking. And when I higher by mask setting, then the higher I set that setting, the more the polygons will be concentrating on the mask and also on the strength of the mask. So where there is 100% masking, you will get 100% of 100% sized fibers, if you will, and where there is less masking, you will have fewer fibers and smaller fibers. Then we come to the embed slider. So right now embed has been set to 0, and this is how much the fibers will get embedded into your mesh. So this is particularly important when you are working with a mesh that is going to be subdivided or smooth subdivided into another program. So when this is 0 and you subdivide your base mesh, then it might be possible that your fibers do not penetrate your base mesh. So when I set it to -2, for instance, then my fibers are going to be put more away from my originating mesh. When I set this to 1 or to 2, they are going to be more into the originating base mesh, as you can see. Then I come to the length profile. So when I open that, I have done a reset. And before I'm going to cover the length profile, I'm going to cover the width profile. Because when I change that profile, changes to the length profile will be more visible. So before that, before the width profile, you have length. So that is the length of your fibers. Higher amount will lengthen, shorter amount will shorten your fibers. I'm going to set it back to 400, or not 4,700, but 400. And you also have length variations. So the higher the length variations, the more variations in the length you will have. So I set first the width profile. Now you can see this profile in such a manner that at the bottom from here to there you have root to tip. So points that you put in here, when they are on this side, you will affect the root. If you are in this side, you will affect the mid of the segment, and if you are on this side, you will affect the tip of the segment. And from here to there, you can see as this is from narrow to wide. So you see in the curve over here, it starts from here and it goes linearly to there, meaning that the width is being modulated from the root being small or narrow, like that, to a wide tip. That is how you can see that curve. And with stopping to draw, my preview has gone, so I'm turning back my preview on. So if I want to have a wide root, I can pull that up or pull that down. And this is fairly narrow, so I'm going to put it up a bit, that it's not that narrow. I could of course also have done a FH to flip horizontal, and if I flip vertical, then I flip it vertically. That is also self-explanatory. So I can also put other points in there, and maybe not that small. Maybe I could lower my max fibers and increase the coverage. The coverage is something that I haven't touched yet, so that is kind of the width of your. So if I reset this and adjust the coverage, then you see it goes from narrow to wide. And if I do an FH in the width profile, then now my root is wide and my tip is very narrow, but I'm going to hide it a bit so it's more visible. And I can, of course, and I'm going to drag it off and on to say, well, I want the root to the mid to stay fairly consistent, and then a sudden change like that. So now from the root you kind of have that consistency, and then from the tip that consistency. It's maybe not a good idea to draw it out like that. Anyway, if I flip this horizontally, then it will go from top to bottom, if you will. So now the tip is wide and the root is narrow. And I can flip this vertically. But anyway, so reset, root wide, tip narrow, and I can modulate in between like that. And with this curve then I can create all kinds of this interesting shapes. Another setting to take into account that I haven't touched yet and that I maybe should have touched yet is the number of segments. So down here you have number of segments. So the lower the settings, the fewer subdivisions, if you will, you have on your fibers. The higher, the more your geometry will be subdivided. So I had already set this to 25, and with a higher number of segments, of course, changing the profile of the width will become more apparent. So off screen, I have changed the width profile a bit. So to go from the root wide to the mid a bit lower wide, and then further up even lower, and then a bit consistent, and then more to the tip wider, and then all the way to the tip slower or narrower. So you could, if I draw that curve like that, that is what I have on my curve. The nuts, you see that reflected over here. So I could draw it out like that, then a bit consistent, then wider, and then narrower. So that profile is what you get over there. So that is what I have done off screen. And now I will cover the length profile. And in the meantime, I had done a reset, but I also have made them like that it's linear, if you will. So what does the length profile do? Well, if I move the root point up, then the segments at the root will be stretched. and when I put the tip up, also the segments of the tip will get stretched. So I can decide with the length profile how much stretching that you have, if you will. That is a kind of scaling of the segments that you can control with the length profile. So if I want a very narrow or very narrow, maybe not narrow the word, but small root, then the root gets squashed if I drag this point over here down. And if I want a stretched tip, then I can pull the point for the tip up. And of course I can also put vertices or control points in between. So to have, for instance, a more consistent stretching. So you see, the further I drag this, the more your mid gets compressed, if you will. The more I pull it over here, the less your mid gets compressed. If I pull this up, then my root will be less compressed, just like that. Now the mid will be more compressed. If I pull it up, again less compressed. So this is how you, and that is also why I had changed the width profile first before touching the length, because now it is more visible what parts are actually being adjusted. So you see, if I manipulate the points that represent the tip, when I pull it up, you get more stretching at the tip. When you pull it down, you get more squashing of the tip. When you pull the root points down, then you will get more squashing at the root. So as you can see, with the combination of these several profiles, you can create really interesting shapes, and it is really, the number of possibilities are so big, it is unbelievable. ZBrush is so great. I can put others in between to modulate the stretching the way you want to create the shape that you are after. So if I draw this, again like I've done with the other profiles, you have again from here to there, from root to tip, and from here to there, you have your stretching at the top, and I call it compressing at the bottom. So if I put a point here and a point there, for instance, to have my curve like that, then I will compress that part so it becomes less long. If I were to put them over here, then my root will do this, then it gets kind of, the segments get kind of scaled up. That is how you can read that curve for the length. So far we have covered everything to the coverage, I believe. So the length determines the length, and then your length profile determines how you stretch out the root part or the mid part or the tip part. So that is a variation on the length. The width profile was something that I've covered, and the coverage is something that I touched also. So with less coverage, your strands will get very narrow. With a lot of coverage, they will become much wider, and you can also put some variation into this so that it's not all uniform. So -0.1 minus 0.01. So anyway, when you go to the positive, you have more variation. Something that you have to experiment with for the shape you are after. And then you have scale root and scale tip. They are both set to 1 over here. So what does that mean? I'm going to zoom in a bit to see the root. When I set this to 0, and ZBrush says, well, I can go to 0, so it's 0.01. What does that mean? That actually means that my tip is very narrow, or my root, sorry, not my tip, my root is very narrow. If I pull this all the way up to 10, now you see that you get a very wide root. So that is a bit much. So scale root, maybe a bit smaller. Scale root a bit higher, more. So anyway, that is something that you can find out for yourself. So scaling of the root is the first segment that gets scaled at the root, if you will. So you can make it very wide if you need to. And for the tip, it's the same principle. So right now, scale tip has set to 1. If I set it all the way down, you see that you get a very sharp segment at the tip. When you pull it all the way up, you get a very wide segment at the tip. So that is what scale root and scale tip do. Then we come to the slim slider. So if I put this to negative, for instance, all the way to -1, then it's kind of my x-axis that gets squashed. So you see that they are really flat now. So if you do it a little less, then they become wider on the x-axis, if you will. And if you go all the way up to 1, then they become flat in the z direction, in the other way direction. So if you set slim to 0, then there is no flattening that is occurring. When you set it to -1, then it kind of gets flattened in the x direction. So then you set it to +1, then it gets kind of flattened in the z direction. And of course you can also get some variation with the SLV slider in here. So if I lower that amount, then playing around with the variation becomes more visible. So 0. So my z direction gets flattened to +1. My x direction gets flattened to -1. Then we come to the Revolve Radius. So this is also a profile. Now right now this is not going to do anything. So I can move these points around, it will not do anything. And that is because my revolve rate is 0. So what is revolve rate? First I'm going to reset that curve and give, for instance, 45 to revolve rate. And then you see that your fibers are being rotated like a corkscrew. And this is being controlled by the revolve radius curve. So again, this is my root and that is my tip. And you see that my root has little revolve and my tip has a lot of revolve. So again, if I would draw this out, you have root to tip, and that's always the case. And then you have your little much revolve, if you look it like that. So if I pull this up, then my root is going to be much more influenced by the revolve, and if I pull this down, then my tip is going to be much less influenced by the revolve. And of course, now it's linear, so I can do this, and yeah, now you see that from the root to the midsection you have a lot of revolve, and then from the midsection to the tip you have less of revolve. So I can of course increase this. If I set it to 90 like that, lower it a bit so that it is not so strong, and maybe do something crazy like that. It's not really crazy, but it really demonstrates that now my tip section, this part, is really being influenced by the revolve. My midsection, and I can make my midsection bigger by dragging that out, is being influenced by the revolve a lot less. And if I pull this up, then my root section is again a lot influenced by the revolve. And of course the number of segments are important, so I can increase maybe the number of segments and make it a bit less. But again, something that you should play around with to get to your final shape that you want. So the higher, the more revolve influence, the lower the point, the less revolve influence. Another thing to note over here when you're playing around with revolve is also to take the length profile into consideration. So when you do a lot of revolve, and I'm going to do a reset and pull this all the way up, then you see that your because of the revolve, your length becomes less. So with the length profile, you could say, well, I want my root to be stretched out more and my tip to be stretched out more. If I do reset, you see that my root now is being squashed all the way. I could pull this all the way up, and that is how you fine-tune your final result. For the revolve, I also should have mentioned that you also have a variation slider, so I have already set it back to 0, so when I give it again a bit of revolve, when I up the revolve variation, you see that it becomes less uniform over the different strands. So back to 0, and then you have twist. So for this I'm going to turn off my revolve back to 0 so that my segments are straight. Go to twist, and you can give it some twist in the negative direction or the positive direction, and of course also some variations on the twist. This is really self-explanatory. And then you come to the gravity profile. Now the gravity profile is not going to have any effect when I change this, and that is because my gravity is 0 at the moment. So when I set this for instance to 0.5 and do a reset of the curve, now you see that at the root I have not or 0 gravity, and at the tip I have 100% gravity. So if I lower this for the tip, you will see that the gravity has less of an effect on the tip. If I pull the root higher, then again it will be more at the root and then maybe less at the tip. and so on. So again, this curve you can see, like when you draw it out, you have your root and to the tip on that plane, and from here to there you have less gravity and more gravity. That is how you can read the curve. So a lot of gravity at the root, no gravity at the root, a lot of gravity at the tip, little gravity at the tip. I can do something intermediate, but of course if I'm going to give a lot of gravity in the middle section, then my tip is also going to still be pulled down. So I can, makes more sense, the curve to over here. If I want the root to the midsection to have no gravity, then I can pull this point all the way over here, and now you see that only the tip is being pulled down. So again, very interesting to play around with the curve. So if I pull it more over there, then I get more in the midsection, and the further I go to the right, the less the midsection has gravity. If I pull it up, then of course I could add intermediate points, and that's how you can create several strands with gravity. And I can also give that some variation, and that is a bit much, so maybe 0.1, and now you see that has also an effect with 0.4, 0.2, 0.3. Can create a kind of root system like that. So back to 0. So that's it for the gravity. And then we come to H tangent and V tangent. Now H tangent slider alters the direction of the fiber by changing the normal value of the support mesh in a horizontal direction. So when I set that all the way up to 1, now the normals of your base mesh kind of have been altered so that my strands are pointing that way in the horizontal direction. Again, set that back to 0, and the V tangent is for the vertical direction. So these settings can be particularly interesting if you were to create plants or trees. So let's say that I accept this, and now I have geometry in the background. Turn off polyframe. So this is actual geometry now. It's still fiber mesh geometry. So if I go to preview settings, I can still turn on for that subtool fast preview. So if I have a lot of geometry, I can turn on fast preview, and I can turn it off to see the actual geometry. And the fact that this is still fiber mesh also means that if I, for instance, choose the move brush and open my brush palette, that when I go to the fiber mesh section for that brush, that I can adjust the fiber mesh settings for that brush. So I can shape that geometry, because this is still fiber mesh geometry. So if I were to subdivide it by pressing Ctrl D, or if I were to subdivide it or alter the geometry, then it's no longer fiber mesh geometry. So that is something also to bear in mind. So I'm going to close that palette now. So this is still fiber mesh geometry. So I was busy talking about the H tangent and the V tangent. So what if I choose this mesh now to be the base mesh for a new geometry, and I'm going to lower the coverage so that it's not so wide, not less coverage. The length, pull that down, and maybe max fibers to 0.3 so that I have a bit more. So now I kind of have branches, if I want, that generate other branches, and now the H tangent and the V tangent become more apparent. And if I give that some variation, maybe pull it all the way up to 1, and maybe max fibers to 0.5, and now accept this, and I get an asking the fast preview rendering for fiber is currently off. So that is what I've shown you earlier. When I press yes, then I have fast preview on for that subtool. So when this was my first one, over here my fast preview has been turned off. I can turn it on and turn it off again. I clicked yes to my second subtool for fast preview. If I don't want fast preview, I can turn it off again. So that is because this is still fiber mesh geometry, you can still manipulate it with the preview settings. And now, I mean, I don't know, polyframe, see, and maybe auto groups. You see that the H tangent and V tangent with variation have made it so that it's not so uniformly spread out over your base mesh. So I'm going to delete. I hope that is clear, that it's not too confusing. So preview again to go back. So your H tangent, you can do that with normal base geometry if the need arises. So in the horizontal direction, the normal is being changed, or in the vertical direction, and you can give it some variation. And I've shown you it is particularly interesting when creating plants. There is an interesting video about creating a tree on Pixologic's YouTube channel, so I suggest to check that out. It demonstrates how you can create a tree with nothing but fiber mesh, and there the H tangent and the V tangent are also demonstrated. And then we get to clumps. So also self-explanatory. When I pull this all the way to 1, you see that the strands are being clumped together. When I pull it all the way to the negative direction, they are being pushed away from each other. So set it to 0, to 1, 0. And of course I can give that also some variation. From 0 to 1, back to 0. So that is clumping. And then we come to the color profile. So this profile will affect how your strands are being colored. So right now my base has been set to black and my tip has been almost white. The B color, base colorize, if I set it to 0, then my base color will not be used. 2.5, then it's half. My tip color, same thing. So when I set it to 0, my tip color is not being used. When I set it to 1, my tip color is being used. Again, you can give that some variety for the different strands. This will become much more apparent when you work with textures. And you can also influence the colorization with the curve. So if I do that, then you see that you can create, if you were to create hairs for an animal or something, they are often not uniformly colorized. So they are often dark at the start and then maybe lighter at the middle and a bit darker at the top. So with the curve, you can adjust. So the lower I go, the more the base is taking into account. The higher I go, the more the tip color is being divided over strands. And if I make this sharp, like I've done, you see that you have sharp transitions. Of course, I can make them smoother. When I pull them off and on again, they are smoother transitions. I have made them all very sharp. So maybe a bit in the middle, like that. A bit darker at the start, a bit lighter at the middle. So playing around with the curve makes that you can colorize your fibers according to your base and your tip colors. And again, it's the same principle as shown before. So you have root from here to there and then tip, and from here to there you have your base color and your tip color. Self-explanatory in this case. You can also work with a texture. So if I open my texture palette and maybe choose that texture, it also asks that the texture is larger than the size specified in the max size modifier. Reducing the texture size will improve memory use and rendering speed. Would you like to auto resize this texture? I press yes. And you have H tiles, so you can increase the number of horizontal tiles, the number of vertical tiles. Now with this texture is not very apparent. Maybe I can use that one. So horizontal tiles does not have a lot of effect with this texture, but vertical tiles will, as you can see. You can make transparent, and that is for when having black in your texture. So when I choose something with black like this, press yes, okay. Now I'm going to zoom in a bit, and when I set transparent all the way up, then the black becomes transparent in your fibers. So I can press anti-aliased. That is useful when using transparent. So with no transparency, it's completely opaque. With transparency, the black parts are completely transparent from your texture. I'm going to put texture off again. And then we come to profile. So I have set my profile originally to 4 when I started out. So when I set it to 1, then I have kind of flat geometry. With 2 it will still be flat. 3 it will be triangulated. 4 and so on. So the higher that setting, the more geometry you create. So if you're working with a lot of fibers, then you should take care with this setting. Usually with working with hair, 2 will do the trick, and then you can go to your BPR settings, and afterwards, now it's grayed out at the moment, but afterwards you can set the number of sides that you want. So if you have created your fiber mesh with a profile of 2, for render, at render time, you can say, no, I want the geometry to have 4 sides. And the number of segments, I've set this to 50 again. The higher that setting, the more geometry you create. So be careful with that setting. And depending on how many strands you have, you may also want to check on fast preview. So once you have a good shape with your settings, then you could turn fast preview on, and then you know the shape, then you don't need to see it anymore. And then increase your fibers or whatever. So it's always a good idea to first create your fibers with little max fibers and then save it out. And then when you open it again, then adjust the max fibers with fast preview on. So you have several ways to go about it. And in this last part, I am going to show you how you can work with a Morph Target, and an interesting application of that can also be found on Pixelogic's YouTube channel. So I suggest you do a search for Morph Target Guided with FIBERMESH Movie. So first I'm going to, in my tool palette, store a Morph Target. And now with the standard brush, I'm going to simply sculpt something, maybe a bit also with depression, and leave it at that, and then switch my Morph Target. So it has gone back to its original form. Then go to FIBERMESH and press preview. Now of course there is no mask, everything is going to be affected, but in the FIBERMESH palette you have a button that is normally grayed out, but because now there is a Morph Target, it is not grayed out. And when I press this, you see that now only where I had fibers where I had sculpt is there are fibers, and here I did a depression. There are actually fibers. So when I do an accept, and I'm going to say no for the fast preview, and hide, select my fiber mesh geometry and unhide the sphere, you see there actually also are fibers going inwards. So when you sculpt inwards, then the fiber mesh will be created in that direction. When you sculpt outwards, the fiber mesh will create it in that direction. So going to pause for a moment and do a quick render. So I have done a render, and of course the part that goes inwards it's not visible because of the sphere. But anyway, this is how you can create fiber mesh starting from a Morph Target. And for now, this concludes this video and my coverage of the fiber mesh modifiers. Hope you found it useful. Bye for now.